Richard Thomas walked away from the role that made him a household name, and for years, network executives couldn't explain why to a public that refused to believe John Boy Walton was really gone. This wasn't a story about a show losing ratings or a cast falling apart in scandal. It was something quieter, and in many ways more human. A group of actors who built one of the most beloved family dramas in American television history, and then, one by one, chose to step away from it. To understand why, you have to go back to the mountain itself, to the small Virginia town of Walton's Mountain that never existed on any map but somehow felt more real to millions of viewers than the towns they actually lived in. The Waltons premiered on CBS in the fall of 1972, based on the semi-autobiographical writings of Earl Hamner Jr., a novelist and screenwriter who had grown up in rural Schuyler, Virginia, during the Great Depression. Hamner's original television film, The Homecoming: A Christmas Story, had performed well enough that CBS greenlit a full series, and what followed was 9 seasons of a program that stood in deliberate contrast to the violence and cynicism creeping into other 1970s dramas. At its center was John Boy Walton, the eldest son, an aspiring writer, played by a 20-year-old actor named Richard Thomas, whose narration opened and closed every episode with the warmth of a man remembering his own childhood. Thomas won an Emmy for the role in 1973, and for a few years, he was inseparable from the character in the minds of American audiences. But inside that success, something was quietly building. In interviews conducted years later, including one with the Television Academy Foundation's Archive of American Television, Richard Thomas spoke candidly about the pressures of playing a single character for years on end, particularly one so closely tied to a specific, wholesome image. Thomas had trained as a serious stage and film actor before the Waltons, studying at the neighborhood playhouse and appearing in films like Last Summer in 1969, a movie dealing with dark, adult themes entirely unlike the gentle world of Walton's Mountain. He had ambitions that extended well beyond narrating a nostalgic family saga, and by the mid-1970s, those ambitions were colliding directly with the realities of network television contracts. There was also something more personal driving Thomas's decision. In the same period he was weighing his future on the show, his wife gave birth to triplets, a life event that reportedly reshaped his priorities in ways that had nothing to do with fame or artistic restlessness. Balancing a grueling television production schedule with a suddenly much larger family proved to be its own kind of pressure, one that doesn't often make it into glossy retrospectives, but that shaped real decisions behind the scenes. By 1977, after 5 seasons, Richard Thomas made the decision to leave the series. CBS and Lorimar Productions, the studio behind the show, were reportedly caught somewhat off guard, since John Boy wasn't just a character. He was the emotional spine of the entire narrative, the voice that opened every single episode. The show's producers made the unusual choice not to kill off or simply erase John Boy, but to recast the role, bringing in actor Robert Whiteman to play an older version of the character starting in the 6th season, with a storyline explaining that John Boy had suffered a near-fatal car accident and returned home changed. It was a bold narrative gamble, and while Whiteman brought his own sincerity to the part, many longtime viewers never fully accepted the switch. Ratings dipped, and the show's producers had to reckon with a difficult truth. Audiences hadn't just been watching a well-written family drama, they had been watching Richard Thomas specifically become that family's storyteller. His departure marked the first major crack in the idea that Walton's Mountain could exist forever, unchanged, regardless of who was standing on it. Thomas has spoken since then, with clear affection rather than regret, about his time on the show and his reasons for leaving it when he did. He has described feeling that he needed to test himself as an actor beyond a single defining role, a sentiment echoed by countless performers who came up through 1970s television, when the industry offered far fewer opportunities to move fluidly between television and film the way actors do today. Leaving the Waltons was, by his own account, less an act of rejection and more an act of self-preservation. A young actor trying to make sure his career wouldn't calcify around one character before he'd had the chance to find out what else he was capable of. If Thomas's departure was about ambition, the loss of Geer, who played the family's beloved patriarch Grandpa Zeb Walton, was about something far more sobering. Geer was already in his early 70s when the show began, a veteran of stage, film, and a long, complicated career that included being blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political activism, a chapter of his life that gave his warm, wise portrayal of Grandpa Walton an unspoken depth. Geer had spent the blacklist years running an outdoor Shakespeare theater in California, and by the time he joined the Waltons, he brought decades of hard-won wisdom to a role that audiences experienced simply as gentle authenticity. In April of 1978, Geer died of respiratory failure at the age of 76. His death wasn't a case of an actor choosing to leave a beloved series behind for other opportunities. It was a loss that the cast and crew had to absorb in real time, in the middle of production, while continuing to tell a story about a fictional family that had, in its own way, become genuinely intertwined with the real one working on set. The show's writers made the decision to have Grandpa Zeb Walton die within the story as well, airing an episode that dealt directly with the family's grief, allowing viewers to mourn alongside the Waltons in a way that felt less like typical television plotting and more like a shared act of remembrance. Cast members later described those episodes as some of the most emotionally difficult of the entire series to film, for reasons that had little to do with performance and everything to do with genuine loss. Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton opposite Geer, faced her own devastating setback just 2 years into the show's run. In 1976, Corby suffered a serious stroke that left her temporarily unable to continue filming, forcing the production to write her character out for a stretch of episodes while she focused on recovery. For many actresses in her position, particularly one already in her 60s, that kind of medical crisis might have marked a quiet, permanent exit from a demanding weekly television schedule. Corby, however, made the decision to return to the show, and rather than concealing the effects of her stroke, the producers and writers chose an unusually honest approach. They incorporated her real physical limitations into the character herself, giving Grandma Walton a stroke within the storyline and showing her slow, difficult path toward recovery on screen. It was a remarkable moment in the history of television, one where the line between actor and character nearly disappeared entirely, and it required a level of vulnerability from Corby that few performers of her era would have accepted. She continued to appear on the show in a reduced capacity for several more seasons, her speech and movement visibly altered, a living reminder to audiences that the people telling the story were dealing with the same fragility and mortality that shaped the fictional Walton family. Corby's decision to keep working, even after such a serious health crisis, wasn't really a story about leaving the show at all. It was a story about a woman fighting to stay part of something she clearly loved, on whatever terms her health would allow. Michael Learned, who played matriarch Olivia Walton, left the series under very different circumstances, and her departure has often been misunderstood by casual fans who assume every cast exit from a long-running show must involve conflict or scandal. Learn was already an accomplished stage actress before joining the Waltons, and she won 3 Emmy Awards for her portrayal of Olivia, a role that anchored the emotional realism of the show alongside Ralph Waite's John Walton Sr. by the later seasons. However, Learned began to feel the pull of other opportunities and other kinds of storytelling, a common experience for performers who spend the better part of a decade inside a single, all-consuming production schedule. The show's writers handled her reduced presence by giving Olivia Walton a tuberculosis storyline, sending the character to Arizona for treatment and recovery, which allowed for Olivia's periodic absence from the mountain without requiring the finality of a death. Learned has discussed in interviews over the years that she felt an artistic need to move on from a role that, while deeply meaningful to her, had begun to feel like a career in itself rather than a single chapter within one. Like Richard Thomas before her, she wasn't running from failure. She was running toward the uncertainty of new work, a choice that speaks to a very particular kind of professional courage, especially for an actress who had already secured her place in television history through the role she was leaving behind. Ralph Waite, the actor who anchored the entire ensemble as family patriarch John Walton Sr., also stepped away before the series finale, though his departure was handled with the same narrative delicacy the writers had shown with Learn's reduced role. Waite left partway through the final season to pursue other projects, and the show explained his absence by sending John Walton Sr. away for an extended stretch tied to wartime shipbuilding work, a plot device that allowed the family's story to continue without erasing the character altogether. Waite, much like his co-stars, wasn't abandoning a show he didn't believe in. He was, like so many actors of his generation, trying to build a career with more than one defining role in it, even while carrying real affection for the Walton family he had helped bring to life. What emerges from these individual stories isn't a portrait of a troubled production plagued by conflict, but something rarer and, in its own way, more moving. A cast that experienced ordinary human life, ambition, illness, aging, grief, the desire for new challenges, while filming one of television's most sincere depictions of an American family. Earl Hamner Jr., who continued narrating the series as the older version of John Boy even after Richard Thomas's departure, later reflected that the show's enduring power came precisely from that sense of lived reality bleeding into the fiction. The actors weren't just performing warmth and resilience. In many cases, they were living it in real time, in front of the cameras. It's worth remembering, too, that the Waltons aired during a stretch of American history defined by disillusionment, the aftermath of Vietnam, the unraveling of Watergate, a growing skepticism toward institutions of every kind. Audiences turned to Walton's Mountain not because it offered an escape from reality, but because it offered a version of reality rooted in resilience, faith, and family loyalty during genuinely difficult times. That's part of why the departures of Thomas, Geer, Corby, Learned, and Waite felt so significant to viewers who had invited this family into their living rooms week after week. These weren't just cast changes. They were losses that mirrored the kinds of losses ordinary families experience: a child growing up and moving away, a grandparent passing, an illness that changes someone forever, a parent needing to step back from responsibilities they'd carried for years. Looking back now, decades after the show ended its original run in 1981, what stands out isn't the fact that these actors eventually left, but how long many of them